Folk horror takes superstition, folklore, and fairy tales and twists them into something even more unsettling. It tugs at our innermost fear that the stories whispered at sleepovers as children were real. On a deeper level, it tells a cautionary tale relative to society's current concerns. Modern folk horror films, such as The Witch, The Devil's Bath, and The Wind, serve as warnings against something much scarier than witches, the devil, or old wives' tales. Society's treatment of those it doesn't understand, especially those who suffer from mental illness. There's a growing trend in modern folk horror films to highlight mental health, which makes sense. The number of people reporting mental health-related issues has steadily been on the rise since the 1990s. The number of adults accessing treatment for common mental illnesses in the UK alone rose from 23.1% in the year 2000 to 47.7% in 2023 to 24. In a refreshing turn of events, mental health is no longer being treated as the villain of the story, but as an unfortunate byproduct of a misunderstanding, judgmental, stressed society that, despite everything we now know, is still only too quick to point an accusatory finger outwards rather than in. As with most folk horror, the theme of isolation is prevalent, but instead of this just being a plot device for lonely protagonists, it's treated as one of the main contributing factors as to why everything goes pear-shaped. Today, I want to talk about how the modern folk horror films The Witch, The Devil's Bath, The Wind, Hagazussa, and You Are Not My Mother all chose to tell the tale of women struggling with mental health issues who are isolated, misunderstood, and judged, rather than listened to and supported, and what we can learn from them. Hi, I'm Nia, by the way. The term folk horror was first used in relation to film in 1970 by Rod Cooper, but wasn't actually popularised until Mark Gatiss's 2010 BBC documentary A History of Horror. The horror subgenre uses folklore from various cultures and moments in time to invoke fear. What if the absurd was real? What if the hushed stories whispered under blankets came to life? What if paranoia was actually premonitory? But folk horror isn't just designed to scare us. Using themes such as isolation, fanatical religion, superstition, and mythical monsters, folk horror films deliver cautionary tales and challenge belief systems. Folklore horror often acts as social commentary, delving into topics such as class structure, misogyny, discrimination, and abuse of power. They're often a snapshot in time, a reflection of society, and most notably what it's afraid of at the time the film was conceptualized. For example, in the 1970s, there was a period of British austerity and in the US Watergate, which resulted in an uptick in people practicing witchcraft, the occult, anti-traditionalism, and anti-Christian sentiment.
Stop that witch!
It's therefore no coincidence that films such as The Wicker Man, which paint pagans as archaic fanatics, were released during this time. They were warnings against returning to the old ways and their restrictions, superstitions, and dangers, while the old ways writhe and grasp mercilessly to maintain their identity against modernity.
I believe in the life eternal, as promised to us by our Lord Jesus Christ.
In Shudder's 2021 documentary Woodlands, Dark and Days Bewitched, Howard Ingham describes folk horror as the juxtaposition of the prosaic and the uncanny. Often overlapping with magic realism, folk horror shows abnormal events occurring in very normal rural settings to normal people. It's a dog howling at 3 a.m, strange symbols etched into a locked door, and a pile of rocks you happen across in the middle of the woods, and sometimes Morris dancers. Folklore has a long history of allegoricizing mental illness in an attempt to explain what we didn't really understand but feared. In ancient Greece and Rome, mental illness was believed to be some sort of divine punishment, the result of the gods taking out their displeasure on humans, and that these gods must be appeased in the form of prayer or even sacrifice in order to treat the condition. At the same time, ancient Greek and Roman physicians such as Hippocrates started to draw connections between the brain and mental disorders. Greco-Roman medical literature shows that they were beginning to document and build an understanding of different mood disorders. Various gods and goddesses often possessed attributes analogous to mental disorders, likely to help people understand. For example, in Greek mythology, Zeus, the king of all gods, was often unpredictable, displaying angry outbursts one minute and kindness the other. Dionysus, the god of wine, could be argued to have substance abuse problems, while Roman goddess of chaos and the undead was named Mania. Despite still believing that the gods caused mental illness, the ancient Greeks and Romans began to observe that they did also have biological causes, with Hippocrates' theory of the four humours. However, when the Roman Empire fell around the 5th century, Europe took a massive step backwards. A great deal of Greco-Roman medical literature was destroyed or lost, and the Catholic Church took charge of all health-related issues. This meant that during the Middle Ages, mental illness was purely blamed on the work of the devil and demonic possession. Folklore warning against the dangers of angering God was both written and embellished during this time, and influenced the Salem witch trials a century later, when women displaying signs of mental illness, such as erratic behaviour, were accused of being in cahoots with the devil, a story we've seen played out many times over in folk horror and religious horror movies. Mental illness being portrayed, whether metaphorically or literally, in horror movies is not uncommon, with varying degrees of sensitivity and realism. Historically, horror movies have centered mental disorders or mentally ill individuals as the villain. However, there's been a shift in modern horror, which tends to use physical monsters to metaphorically allude to mental health struggles. For example, The Babadook, Hereditary, Midsommar, The Descent all deal with processing grief and trauma. It Follows has many interpretations, but for many, it felt like a metaphor for depression. Smile portrays putting on a mask while carrying stress and anxiety. Martyrs explores the effects of extreme trauma, and so on. This isn't to say that we've got it completely right. Split faced valid criticism for its portrayal of dissociative identity disorder, but for the most part, we appear to be heading in the right direction. This isn't a commentary on my personal opinions on these films. I think we can enjoy art while listening to and acknowledging criticisms and concerns. If we zoom in further, folklore horror has been a huge subgenre for directly or indirectly depicting mental health because, as we just discussed, a considerable amount of folklore stems from misunderstanding and misdiagnosed mental health related issues, which leads me neatly to The Witch. Heavy spoiler warning for the films I'm talking about in this video. Robert Eggers' 2015 feature-length debut, The Witch, deals with mental health-related topics like grief-induced psychosis and trauma, but ultimately we're shown how isolation, misunderstanding, and religious dogma are the real dangers. And this is despite a literal witch just snatching up children left and right and making their lives a misery. The Witch tells the story of a 17th century Puritan family who are cast out from their New England settlement for prideful conceit after the father William refuses to accept the community's interpretation of the gospel. The family starts a farm on the edge of the forest where they attempt to make ends meet by themselves. One day, their baby, Samuel, mysteriously and suddenly disappears while in their eldest daughter, Thomason's care. While the family initially presume baby Samuel's kidnapper is four-legged, their isolation and compounding grief, particularly their mother Catherine's, begins to eat away at them. Their family structure crumbles, and each one of the children, apart from Thomason, disappears and/or kicks the bucket. We're shown how, without community, Catherine falls apart after the disappearance of her baby. While grief is part of life, and not necessarily a mental illness in and of itself, the resulting erratic behaviour, paranoia, and venom that she hurls towards Thomason could be interpreted as depression or even grief-induced psychosis. In a disturbing scene towards the film's climax, after hallucinating seeing her now-deceased son Caleb holding baby Samuel, we witness a distraught Catherine sitting in a chair laughing as she believes she's breastfeeding her missing baby, when in reality she's been pecked at by ravens. The next morning she attacks Thomason, who is forced to defend herself with a billhook. What's interesting is that, as the viewer, while Catherine's finger-pointing is initially a bit frustrating, since we're the only people who have seen the actual witch and know of Thomason's innocence, apart from Caleb, Lukas, and Mercy, who are no longer with us by this point, RIP, we never feel that Catherine is evil. What Kate Dickie does superbly as Catherine is play a fraught, traumatised mother who is completely sick with grief, just trying to latch on to any answer, no matter how harrowing that answer is, even if that means placing the blame on her own daughter. Accusing her of being a witch was unfortunately par for the course for 17th century Puritans, especially those who had just immigrated over from England towards the end of the European witch trials which this family had. And let's face it, it is a pretty logical conclusion to come to, considering Thomasin was the only other person present when all of her siblings went missing. We're led to believe that dark forces could be at play for Catherine's deteriorating mental state, but I think even the most emotionally stable person would probably have at least a few questions for Thomasin. Whether you hold the belief that Catherine's deteriorating mental state is the result of dark forces, trauma, or both, we don't necessarily fear Catherine, we feel for her. She's a mother who has unexpectedly lost almost all of her children, with next to no support system, and a husband who insists that it's their own fault and that God is punishing them. Thomasin's final moments, shown in the film, in which she joins a coven of witches and starts levitating, could depict an almost nihilistic, inevitable surrender to one's fate or destiny, but it could also show Thomasin finally finding her real community, a support system of like-minded women free from the shackles of society and expectation, a luxury her mother never got to experience. Shudder's The Devil's Bath from 2024, while technically labelled as a historical horror, contains a lot of elements of 18th century German superstitions and localised religious dogma, which, in my opinion, places it firmly in the folk horror category. It also hits a lot of the same beats as The Witch. The isolated cottage in the woods setting, a shocking scene near the beginning involving a baby in a river, the slow burn paired with beautiful, earthy cinematography and imagery. It also has a goat. Most relevantly, it deals with a young woman's mental health deteriorating through isolation and misunderstanding rooted in religion, with tragic consequences. The Devil's Bath was directed by Austrian duo Veronika Franz and Severin Fiala, who you might know from the infamous psychological horror Goodnight Mummy and The Lodge, which should give you a rough idea of how unflinching this film's approach to storytelling is. The Devil's Bath is based on the book Suicide by Proxy in Early Modern Germany by Kathy Stewart, as well as the very real criminal trials of Agnes Catherine Schicken and Ava Litzelfellnerin. Agnes took the life of a 7-year-old boy, while Ava threw a baby in a river, a scene we see play out in the beginning of the film. Suicide by proxy was widespread during this time. In fact, there were around 300 cases, most of which occurred in the 1700s. Taking your own life would land you in hell, but people, most notably women, experiencing mistreated and misunderstood mental disorders were desperate for a way out. Therefore, committing a crime, confessing, repenting, and facing execution was their only option. Set in 18th century Germany, The Devil's Bath tells the harrowing story of Agnes, who marries a man named Wolf and moves to a small secluded cottage in the woods that he's bought. Although they're content enough at first, marital problems, an overbearing mother-in-law, pressure to have a baby, and isolation from her family begin to take their toll, and Agnes begins to self-harm and show signs of melancholia, or what we now understand to be depression. The Devil's Bath is an intense, frustrating watch as we witness a young woman clearly dealing with severe depression, misunderstood and mistreated, knowing that at the time there wasn't much else anyone could do. The cinematography drags us down with her, starting bright and warm with Wolf and Agnes's wedding and gradually becoming darker and darker. In a particularly distressing scene, we see Agnes turn up at her old house, begging her brother and mum to have her back home, but Wolf collects her and drags her, literally kicking and screaming, back to their cottage. Afterwards, Agnes becomes completely despondent, refusing to get out of bed. While her husband shows glimpses of genuine concern, he's mostly confused and frustrated with her as he doesn't understand what's happening to his wife. So he does what most people would have done in 18th century Germany. He takes her to see a priest. The treatment for Agnes's depression, as was common practice, was praying, because just like in The Witch, mental illness was seen as a moral failing or punishment, and something that needed to be atoned for. The priest also sends Agnes to a barber, who sews a single horsehair through the back of Agnes's neck so that the wound will fester and the poison will leak out, which again was standard procedure for the time. Agnes, unsurprisingly, due to a lack of proper intervention, continues her downward spiral. In one pivotal scene, she steals a baby that's been left unattended in the woods, and it feels as if this is the moment we, the audience, as well as her husband and mother-in-law, begin to see that there may be no way out for Agnes, that this may be the point of no return, a point she never should have reached, and if she had been alive today, probably wouldn't. At this point in the film, she's experiencing delusions and falls into a deep catatonic sadness. Eventually, Agnes attempts to take her own life and fails, so Wolf, at his wit's end, takes her back to live with her mother and brother. However, the next morning, she calmly gets dressed, leaves, and ends the life of a little boy. She confesses straight away and is executed for her crime. The ending feels similar to The Witch in the sense that it shows Agnes fully giving in and surrendering to her fate, although tonally it's very different. She's so lost and unwell and doesn't see another way out. She also understands that taking one's own life is a sin according to the church, so dying via someone else's hand seems, in her mind, to be the most logical solution to rid herself of this torment and make it to heaven. She succumbs to her illness, and while what she does is terrible, we don't hate her. Just like Catherine in The Witch, we see a deeply unwell woman who is pushed to her limit and has learnt of a loophole in the dogmatic Catholic rules that have been imposed upon her. She was a victim of these rules, isolation, and the unavoidably limited knowledge of mental health at the time. The Devil's Bath is a prime example of how isolation, misunderstanding, and a society driven by dogma can be disastrous. The source of Agnes's depression wasn't unique to the time period. The pressure to be perfect and the stress of feeling like you're doing it alone are very much problems today, which is a message that Veronika, Franz, and Severin Fiala really wanted to send.
We always knew that making a film about the past, like only about the past, doesn't make much sense. It's not meant to be a history lesson or like a museum visit. We always wanted to say something about like life today and society today. And Agnes, like when we read the court transcripts, we felt she had very modern problems in certain aspects. She was, or she seemed to have been a perfectionist in a way, and she always thought she wasn't good enough. She always looked for the fault in her, in herself.
As Agnes stares directly into the camera for her final confession, a scene deliberately shot in only one take, it feels intensely personal. We realise that not only does this film give a voice to the women who committed suicide by proxy, who felt they had no other option, but also to women now. The Wind is a unique Western folk horror film that explores the affliction of so-called prairie madness, and links this to the theory that the wind, to quote the writer Teresa Sutherland, used to send women crazy, something philosophers the world over have been alluding to for centuries. Directed by Tammi, The Wind tells the story of Lizzie, a German immigrant who's just moved to New Mexico from St. Louis with her husband Isaac. Right off the bat, we're thrown into an unsettling situation, as we're shown Lizzie cradling a newborn baby that didn't make it, followed by a woman, the mother, being buried along with the baby. We're then thrown from pillar to post as we're shown the events that led up to this moment, as well as what happens after, using a non-linear narrative. The cabin that Lizzie and Isaac recently moved to is completely isolated, apart from one distant neighbour, another married couple called Emma and Gideon. The women, who were figuratively shackled to their respective homes, separated from family and community, begin to show signs of delusion and depression. First, Emma has a breakdown, claiming that she's getting nighttime visits from a demon. We discover that the baby that Lizzie is holding in the first scene that we see was, in fact, Emma's, whom Lizzie tried to save after it appears Emma took her own life. As the story unfolds, we're shown that Lizzie too begins to experience strange, possibly supernatural events, which ramp up after Isaac leaves with Gideon to go and report Emma's death to the proper authorities. A pack of wolves attack one of their goats, but it turns up alive and creepy the next day. She sees a light on at Emma and Gideon's cabin despite no one being home, goes to investigate and experiences objects moving on their own. We're shown that before Isaac's departure, Lizzie was already showing signs of distress, depression and paranoia, something that's shrugged off and even ignored by her husband. And we come to understand that she suffered a miscarriage some time ago, which she's still grieving and struggling with. At one point, Lizzie, similar to Catherine in The Witch, literally says to her husband, "This place is wrong," and he fails to truly listen to what she's saying. His inability to just listen to her for a damn minute is further hammered home by the fact that he won't allow her to speak her mother tongue, German, around him. As Lizzie's husband fails to support or even believe her, the paranormal force gets even more violent whenever she's left alone, and she believes a demon of the prairie is tormenting her. Her eventual discovery of Emma's diary detailing her affair with Isaac, as you can probably imagine, only makes matters worse. We're made aware that Emma didn't take her own life while pregnant with what we now know to be Isaac's baby. It was Lizzie, delusional with jealousy and grief. When Isaac returns from reporting Emma's death, the demon appears to possess him. Lizzie is forced to defend herself with a shard of glass. Lizzie walks outside of the shack she shared with her now deceased husband and sits on the ground. it becomes clear, at least at face value, that there probably wasn't a demon or the devil, only her own deteriorating mental health, left untreated as she's dealt with grief, isolation, and lack of support from the one person she thought she could trust. While prairie madness did happen to men, it was more prevalent among American frontier women in the 19th century due to the intense solitude and isolation of their homes. Husbands were usually able to leave the homestead for supplies and work, as we see in the film, so they get to socialize and experience community. Their wives didn't. They were left alone with just the fierce wind unobstructedly blowing across the prairie as it constantly whistled, whispered, and dusted through their home. This was portrayed excellently in the film, as you can almost constantly hear the wind or see it affecting the environment in some way, and it begins to feel foreboding and dark, like a storm's coming. The wind reminds me of The Witch in a few ways. Tonally, it feels bleak and borderline nihilistic, as if nothing could be done, and this was always how events were going to play out, as they did for numerous women in the 19th century. The ending for me shows Lizzie appearing to finally have come to terms with what's been happening to her, although it's too late. There's a feeling of surrender and acceptance, just like when Thomasin essentially succumbs to the temptation to live deliciously with the other witches. We don't see Lizzie as evil, we just see her as unwell, disturbed, traumatised from losing a child and neglected, similar to Catherine. Like the Devil's Bath, as frustrating as Isaac's behaviour towards her is through a modern lens, this was likely how a frontier husband would have reacted to his wife acting as she does at the time, because they simply didn't know any better, although he probably didn't need to have an affair with the neighbour.
Please don't be unpleasant in front of the men.
Again, in The Wind, Lizzie's apparent mental illness causes her to commit horrific acts, yet we're never made to feel like she's inherently evil. Her sickness is a product of her environment, and like the other films discussed, we're instead encouraged to understand what the people of the time couldn't, so that we as a society don't repeat these same mistakes. Like The Devil's Bath, The Wind gives a voice to these lonely, isolated, stressed women who felt they had no one to turn to. If you liked The Witch, Hagazussa is always the first film I'll recommend to you. Before I get into it, though, I will say that it's a grimy folk horror that I think a lot of people should watch with caution, and potentially look up some of the darker themes it covers beforehand. For this reason, I'm going to have to be very careful with my wording, and I'm not going to dive too deeply into some of the more specific scenes, as it really is very, very dark and grim in places. Stunning but grim. Basically, imagine that scene in The Witch and turn it up to 11. Hagazussa was unbelievably Lukas Feigelfeld's final project for film school and his feature-length debut. It tells the tragic tale of Albrun, the daughter of a goat herder in 15th century Austria. They live in an isolated cottage together, and it's made clear right off the bat that other people in the area believe her mother to be a witch. Albrun's mother is mentally and physically unwell, and her treatment of Albrun is abusive and gross. When her mother passes away near the beginning of the film, Albrun is left completely alone. We then time skip 15 years. Albrun has grown up and has a baby, and there's no sign of the father, and she has no friends. Completely isolated and alone, we learn that her mental health is not in a good place at all. At times, she often hears her deceased mother whispering to her, and there's also a disturbing scene with a goat, although I really wish there wasn't. When Albrun finally believes she's made a friend, a woman called Swinda, she's tricked and violated in the worst way by an acquaintance, as they believe Albrun to be a heathen, aka a pagan. Albrun doesn't talk the entire film, and since we're alone with her for most of it, there's very little dialogue, which makes the atmosphere feel so bleak. She quite literally has no voice, or if she does, she never uses it. It's therefore incredibly quiet apart from Hamid's eerie score. In fact, I have to take a moment to talk about the score because it's horrific, and I mean that in the most complimentary way. It's one of the most effective scores I've ever heard. It's so ambient and low frequency and dark. This may only resonate with some people, but to me, if depression had a sound, this would be it. And it makes the entire film feel so doomed and desperate and gross, despite how visually gorgeous it is. After experiencing the traumatizing event I just mentioned, set up by her new supposed friend, Swinda, Albrun's mental state understandably worsens. She takes her baby into the woods, eats some mushrooms, and this is where everything gets really unsettling. Well, even more so. One of the scenes involving her baby that comes after this, which I'm not sure I even want to try and describe, is truly disgusting. As I said, Hagazussa is far from an easy watch. It deals with some really gross themes, which are juxtaposed with some of the most stunning cinematography I've ever seen. It shines a soft focus light on the taboo, tentatively tiptoeing the line between gritty storytelling and a bit too much. It challenges the viewer. It says, do you see this? Will you look at this? Or will you look away like everyone else? As one horrific traumatizing event after another happens to Albrun, you feel desperate for her. You wonder, how much can one person take? Surely the human brain is not supposed to endure so much trauma. The entire film, and especially the shocking ending which sees Albrun hike up a mountain and catch fire in the sun, is up for interpretation. We don't know why she catches fire or how, although symbolically we could view it as a witch being burnt at the stake. Still, this wasn't what stuck with me after watching it. What stuck with me was the abhorrent mistreatment of a young woman who had experienced more trauma, betrayal, and misunderstanding than any person should have to withstand. Isolation was both her saviour, because it kept people who wished ill upon her away, but it was also her undoing. As if she had never been isolated, she may not have struggled as much, or, due to the actions of her mother, perhaps she was never given a fighting chance. The full title of the film is Hagazussa, A Heathen's Curse, which implies that Albrun was always destined to meet such a sickening fate. She was cursed. Other people believe her mother, and by extension her, to be a witch or heathen, and therefore the events of the film are the price she pays for that. For simply being different, isolated, and misunderstood, she was doomed to suffer an awful life. 15th century Austria wouldn't have had therapy or medication to help her deal with her trauma, so, like the devil's bath and the wind, perhaps the outcome was always inevitable. It feels like watching a nightmare or hell through someone else's eyes. As a result, all we feel is empathy and sadness. You Are Not My Mother is an intriguing modern Irish folk horror from 2021, written and directed by Kate Dolan. We follow a teenage girl called Shar, who has to deal with her mother, Angela, being swapped with a changeling, a supernatural entity from Celtic folklore that was said to switch places with human beings, often for nefarious reasons. The film approaches mental illness from a couple of angles. Firstly, we see Angela bedridden with depression. This is before anything supernatural has happened. Caroline Bracken, who plays Angela, gives a stunningly realistic, convincing portrayal of someone experiencing a depressive episode. As she forces herself out of bed to give Shar a lift to school, you can feel the frustration with herself through the screen. She's despondent and spaced out. She's so disassociative that she almost gets into a car accident. When Angela goes missing after Shar gets out of her car and it's found abandoned near a body of water, we fear the worst. However, Angela later shows up at home and she's seemingly cured. She's upbeat, dancing to Joe Dolan, chopping a pumpkin for dinner, wearing a dress. I have to applaud Hazel Dupe for the way she plays Shar here. It's so subtle and real. You can tell she wants to believe her mum is better, that she's back to the way she was before she developed depression, so she appears tentatively happy. However, at the back of her mind, we can tell that she knows it's all too good to be true, considering that less than 24 hours ago, her mother was missing. In reality, depression has peaks and troughs, and it's likely that Shar has experienced these before and is therefore aware of her mum's miraculous recovery. As the story progresses, Shar, along with the audience, begins to notice that her mum is acting a little off. I mean, for one, in a really cool scene, she sticks her entire forearm down her own throat to bring up the medication that she's been taking under doctor's orders, so that's bound to get alarm bells ringing. You Are Not My Mother has some really well done unnerving scenes like this, which were effective at conveying that Angela was no longer herself before we discover that she's been swapped with a changeling. The climax of the film sees Shar lure Angela inside a huge Samhain bonfire and set fire to her. Historically, these bonfires were said to scare away evil spirits, as this was a time when spirits were said to be able to travel more freely between our two worlds. Fortunately, all's well that ends well, and Angela, the real one this time, shows up at home alive and well. Another way You Are Not My Mother portrays mental health, other than literally, as Angela battles with very real depression, is as an entire metaphor for mental illness, which is something director Kate Dolan has alluded to.
I wanted to write a story about kind of mental illness in a family and how, when somebody's unwell, they aren't themselves, and how you kind of deal with that. And then the changeling myth felt like it was a great way to tell that story.
What's important is the support of those around us. Shar knew that the changeling wasn't her real mother and took the appropriate steps to get her mother back. We don't blame her mother for the changeling targeting her, and we empathise with her daughter. Angela's mental state leaves her feeling as if she's alone, which leaves her vulnerable to dark forces. Similarly, Char is isolated after being moved ahead a year at school. She doesn't have any friends and is relentlessly bullied. After the changeling in her mother's body poisons Char's uncle Aaron with the medication she's supposed to be taking, and then gets rid of Char's grandmother, Char is basically left alone. You Are Not My Mother therefore highlights the importance of support for those more vulnerable, as well as understanding and empathy. Folk horror often tells us a cautionary tale, harnessing fears relative to the current time and serving us a warning to never return to these old ways. These modern folk horror films are no different. They warn us against isolation and ostracizing others. They urge us to support those around us when they need us and to seek community, and to lead with understanding instead of favouring rules and religious dogma over personal connection. Society may not have known how to treat someone clearly dealing with depression in the 18th century, but now we do. Let's not let history repeat itself. There's also a space here to talk about the hysterical woman archetype, but that's another video for another day. Oh, and they also warn us to stay away from goats.